When Matteo Varela buried his kitchen 14 feet into the red dirt outside Mesa de Oro, people said he'd finally gone strange. They called it a mole hole, a panic room for soup cans. Grant Holloway, the developer with the glass house on the ridge, called it a very expensive basement for a man who didn't trust air conditioning. Then, in July of 2021, the heat came down so hard it bent power lines, cracked windows, and turned the valley into an oven. And the only room that stayed livable was the one everybody laughed at. Matteo was 67 years old, a retired commercial refrigeration contractor who had spent 4 decades keeping grocery warehouses, hospital coolers, and produce sheds alive when everybody else's systems failed. He did not hate technology. He hated dependency. He had seen too many towns go soft on convenience. Too many people trust a thermostat more than physics. Too many homes built like showroom pieces for climates that did not care what they cost. So when he bought 5 acres at the edge of Mesa de Oro, he did not build a wide-windowed desert showcase with smart glass and app-controlled shades. He built an adobe house around a sunken summer kitchen. 14 feet below grade, rammed earth walls, poured concrete shell, limestone floor thick enough to hold a week's worth of cool. 2 intake tubes buried out toward the arroyo where the soil stayed dense and shaded. A tall black ventilation chimney on the south side designed to pull hot air upward by convection. Low voltage lights on battery backup. A hand pump tied to a buried cistern, and a small propane range that didn't care whether the utility company was having a good day. At that depth, Matteo liked to say, the earth stopped listening to the weather. In winter or summer, the soil held close to 62 degrees. The locals did not appreciate the elegance of that statement. At the feed store, men in clean baseball caps laughed into paper cups and asked if Matteo planned to hide from the apocalypse with jars of peaches and beans. At the cafe off Highway 68, women joked that his daughter would never visit because no grown woman wanted to cook inside a cave. Grant Holloway enjoyed the jokes the most. Grant was 58, broad-shouldered, silver-haired, and rich enough to confuse money with expertise. He had made his fortune building boutique desert resorts for people who wanted wild scenery without experiencing any actual discomfort. His own house sat half a mile up the ridge in a slab of steel, polished concrete, and west-facing glass. It had automated louvers, radiant floors, silent vents, hidden speakers, and a rooftop array that he mentioned the way other men mentioned grandchildren. The first week Matteo's excavation was open, Grant rolled up in a white electric SUV, stood at the edge of the pit, and smiled down like a man inspecting a failed investment. "Matteo," he said, "you know normal people just install better insulation, right? Mateo, standing below in work gloves and dust, looked up and said, "Normal people also believe the grid is permanent." Grant laughed. "I'll take my chances with civilization." Mateo went back to work. By the time the room was finished, even his daughter Elena had questions. Elena was 35, an architect in Denver, sharp, affectionate, and professionally offended by the idea that her father had spent retirement money building something she described as half root cellar, half monastery. When she came down for a visit in the second week of July 2021, she stood at the top of the broad plaster stair, peering into the cool dimness below. The room was beautiful in Mateo's severe, practical way. Hand-troweled clay plaster, heavy walnut shelves, a long butcher block island, terracotta jars, copper pans, a table positioned under the vent shaft where a thin, moving ribbon of air could always be felt across the skin. The whole space smelled faintly of lime wash, cedar, and stone. "It's gorgeous," Elena admitted. "But it still feels like you built a chapel for soup." Mateo smiled without looking up from the tomatoes he was slicing. "I built a room that works when the rest of the house doesn't." Elena leaned against the wall and crossed her arms. "Dad, the house has a high-efficiency heat pump, solar backup, thermal glazing, and transmission lines 2 counties over," Mateo said, "and a substation that was upgraded by the lowest bidder. The weak part is never the thing people paid for. It's everything they assumed." Elena rolled her eyes, but she was smiling. She had heard versions of that speech her whole life. For 2 days, the valley simmered. The Weather Service called it a stationary upper ridge. The local station called it a historic heat dome. The old men at the cafe called it punishment. By Thursday afternoon, the outside air temperature hit 116. The blacktop at the gas station went tacky. The metal door handles on parked trucks had to be opened with shirts wrapped around hands. Even the cottonwoods along the acequia looked exhausted. Then the warnings changed. A brush fire sparked west of the transmission corridor after a blown line hit dry grass. Utilities across 3 counties began cycling emergency shutoffs to keep the whole system from collapsing. The sheriff's office pushed alerts telling residents to conserve power, stay indoors, and prepare for extended outages. Hospitals shifted to generator protocol. Cell service started to lag. At 4:52 p.m., Grant texted Mateo a picture of his own thermostat reading 72 degrees. Caption: "Still think dirt beats engineering?" Mateo looked at the message, locked his phone, and carried 2 more crates of food down into the summer kitchen. Elena watched him from the stairs. "You really think it's going to get that bad?" Mateo set the crates beside the island. Dried beans, rice, salt, olive oil, peaches, drinking water, candles, first aid kit, tool roll, a battery radio, respirators still in plastic. Then he looked up at her. "Bring down blankets. Bring the med bag. Bring every rechargeable lantern. When the power goes, we stay below." The grid died at 6:11 p.m. Not gradually, not with a polite flicker, 1 second the ceiling fans above were turning, the next second the house went silent so completely Elena could hear the ticking of the cooling stove upstairs. Then came a sound from somewhere out in the valley, like giant sheet metal snapping in the sky. Transformer failure, one after another. Within 40 minutes, the main level of the house began to change character. The air stopped moving. The walls stopped shedding heat. The big clear-story windows facing west turned amber, then white with the force of the sun and the smoke thickening on the horizon. By 7 p.m., the upstairs thermostat read 92. By 7:40, it read 98. Elena stood in the living room in shorts and a t-shirt, sweat rolling down her spine, and stared at the dead air vent. "It feels wrong," she said. "It's like the house is holding its breath." Matteo handed her a lantern. "That's because it is." They went downstairs. The difference was immediate. At the top of the plaster stairs, the air still carried the stale, rising heat of the dead house above. Halfway down, the temperature dropped. At the bottom, it settled around them like cool water. The summer kitchen sat at 71 degrees, not cold, stable. The floor held the night. The walls held the earth. The vent chimney drew the warmest indoor air upward and out. The buried intake tubes pulled in cooler air from deep shade beneath the arroyo bank. Every design choice Matteo had paid for in ridicule was now doing exactly what he had built it to do. Elena pressed her palm against the clay wall and frowned. "It's comfortable." Matteo lit 2 candles on the table, though the battery lanterns were enough. "The desert punishes surfaces," he said. "You survive it by getting out of the argument." Outside, the evening turned feral. Smoke from the west fire spread low and ugly across the valley. Dry wind came down through the pass hard enough to slap grit against the upstairs windows. The utility alert tone on Matteo's battery radio repeated every 12 minutes. Extreme heat emergency, wildfire growth, infrastructure instability, shelter in place. By full dark, Mesa de Oro looked less like a community than a set of dying electronic signals scattered across a furnace. Then, at 9:13 p.m., the radio hissed with local chatter. Most people in the valley kept old FRS sets or handheld radios for outages and hunting trips. Usually it was aimless talk. Fence line updates, water tank levels, complaints. This time, the voice was ragged. "Anybody copy? Anybody on County Road 9? This is Grant Holloway. My west wall cracked. AC's dead. Smoke in the house. Noah can't stop throwing up." Elena looked at Matteo. The radio crackled again. "Indoor temps 107. He's dizzy. I can't get the garage door open. If anybody can hear me, answer." Matteo reached for the handset. "This is Matteo." A burst of static. Then a sound Elena had never heard from Grant Holloway before. Fear. "Matteo. Please. Please. He's getting confused." Grant's sleek house had been built for views, not failure. The west wall was mostly glass. The backup batteries only handled lighting and security, not full cooling. Once the power died and the smoke-laden heat pressed against the structure, the whole place would behave like an expensive greenhouse. "How far gone is he?" Mateo asked. 16. Skin's hot. He was talking nonsense 5 minutes ago. Grant's voice cracked. "I tried wet towels. It's not enough." Mateo looked toward the stairs. Outside, the wind was carrying smoke and heat together now. Not flame at his door, not yet, but the kind of air that stripped the throat raw in one breath and turned distance into punishment. Elena already knew what he was thinking. "You are not going alone." Mateo turned sharply. "Yes, I am." "You're 67. "And he's a half-mile uphill in a glass box." Elena stepped closer, her jaw set. "Then I'm helping." Mateo held her gaze for 1 second. Then he moved to the storage bench built under the shelves and lifted the lid. Inside were the things Elena had quietly assumed were props for one of her father's preparedness moods. 2 respirators, smoke goggles, leather gloves, climbing harnesses, 100 feet of static rope, 2 wool blankets sealed in plastic, duct tape, carabiners, and a compact trauma kit. "I hoped I'd never use these," Mateo said. He clipped one end of the rope to a steel anchor plate bolted into the stair support column. He ran the line upstairs, out through the mudroom, and locked the tail to a second anchor set in the concrete porch footing. "The old retaining wall runs almost straight to Grant's lower patio," he said. "I follow the wall, I find the house. If I lose visibility, the rope brings me back." Elena pulled on gloves. "Then I'm on the line." Mateo nodded once. He put on the respirator, tightened the harness, took a spare for Grant, and shoved both sealed wool blankets under his arm. Before opening the mudroom door, he stopped and looked back at Elena. "If I pull twice, feed line. If I pull 3 times, lock it and brace. When I come back, you do not let go." Her face had gone pale, but her voice stayed steady. "I know." The moment Mateo stepped outside, the heat hit like machinery. Night should have brought relief. It brought none. The air still felt above 100. Smoke and dust moved through the beam of his headlamp in violent sheets. Somewhere west, beyond the ridge, the fire painted the sky a pulsing iron red. Wind shoved at him hard enough to throw his balance off on the porch steps. He kept one hand on the rope and the other out toward the low retaining wall that separated his drive from the slope. Step by step, he moved uphill. The smoke got worse halfway there. He could feel the grit grinding between his teeth every time the respirator seal shifted. His shirt soaked through under the harness. Once, a gust hit so hard he dropped to one knee and stayed there until the world stopped moving sideways. Grant's house emerged out of the smoke in pieces. First, the roofline, then the black steel pergola. Then the shattered glare of the west facade. A panel of tempered glass had failed completely. Two more had spiderwebbed from corner to corner. The automated louvers were frozen half open. Inside, white curtains thrashed in the superheated wind like something alive. Mateo unclipped from the wall side, kept hold of the rope, and forced his way through the side courtyard. "Grant!" he shouted. No answer. He followed the sound of a generator alarm beeping somewhere useless in the garage. Then he found them in the laundry room on the east side of the house, the one space without exterior glass. Grant was on the floor with his son Noah slumped against him. The boy's face was frighteningly red. His eyes were half open but unfocused. Sweat had stopped. His lips were dry and cracked. Classic heat stroke. Grant looked up through the haze, saw Mateo framed in smoke goggles and dust, and for a second seemed unable to process him. "You came. Can he walk?" Grant shook his head. "Barely." Mateo dropped to one knee, pressed two fingers to Noah's neck, then peeled open one eyelid with a gloved thumb. Slow response. "We move now," Mateo said. "Not in 5 minutes, not after water. Now." He forced the spare respirator over Noah's face, cinched it tight, wrapped one sealed wool blanket around the boy's shoulders to block the hot wind and blowing grit, then taped the blanket closed at the chest and waist. He clipped Noah to the main rope with a locking carabiner. Then he snapped Grant onto a second loop behind him. Grant stared at the rope like a man seeing religion for the first time. Mateo grabbed him by the shirt. "Listen carefully. You do not let go of the line. If Noah falls, you drag him. If you fall, you crawl. If you stop in that yard, the heat takes you first, and the smoke takes you second. Do you understand?" Grant nodded hard. The trip back felt twice as long. Noah stumbled almost immediately. His legs kept folding under him, and every time he dropped, the rope jerked tight, and Mateo had to haul him forward by force. Grant was stronger than Mateo expected, but panic kept making him do stupid things, like turning his head to look back, or trying to shield the boy instead of moving. "Forward!" Mateo roared through the respirator. A gust blew burning ash across the slope, enough bright orange sparks to make Elena, watching from the porch through smoke goggles, feed line in with shaking hands and start praying out loud. Then the rope snapped twice. She braced and gave it slack. Seconds later, she saw shapes in the smoke. 3 of them. She locked the line around the porch post, ran down the steps, grabbed Noah under one arm and Mateo's harness with the other, and helped drag them through the mudroom and down the plaster stairs into the cooling room below. The door slammed behind them. The silence felt almost impossible. No wind, no grit, no radiant heat, just breath, stone, and the low ticking flame of the propane burner Mateo had lit for boiling water. Noah collapsed onto a mattress pad beside the wall. Elena stripped the hot blanket off him, soaked towels from the cistern sink, and laid them over his neck, wrists, and chest. Mateo mixed oral rehydration salts in a metal cup. Grant sat on the floor, staring at the room around him as if it had materialized from another century. He touched the clay wall. "It's cool." Mateo was too tired to answer. For the next 12 hours, the cooling room became a lifeboat. They sealed the upstairs doors with damp towels to block smoke drift. They rationed battery lights. They rotated cloths on Noah until his skin cooled and his speech started making sense again. They ate peaches, flatbread, and canned beans. Outside, the valley stayed trapped in a dark orange night lit by the distant movement of wildfire and the occasional blue blink of failing equipment somewhere beyond the ridge. Near dawn, Noah finally slept. Grant sat with his back against the shelves, staring at the floor. "I told everyone you built this because you were scared." Mateo poured a little water into a cup and handed it to him. "I did build it because I was scared," he said. "I was just scared of the correct things." Grant looked like he wanted to laugh, but something heavier stopped him. By late morning, the second problem arrived. The battery air quality monitor on the island began to chirp. Not loudly, just enough to make Elena look up. Carbon dioxide was climbing. Indoor temperature had crept from 71 to 78. The thin thread of air under the vent shaft was weaker. The propane flame under the kettle, which had burned steady blue all night, fluttered and burned lazy orange. Mateo stood very still. Then he looked toward the intake wall. The buried earth tubes on the north side should have been drawing cooler outside air through shaded soil and feeding the room continuously. But the fire had changed everything. Ash, wind-blown debris, heat pulse. Somewhere outside, one or both intake heads had to be packed shut. Grant pushed himself upright. "What happens if they're blocked?" Mateo answered without drama. "This room stops breathing." Elena looked toward the stair door. "We open upstairs?" Mateo shook his head instantly. "The air above is hotter than a commercial oven, and half the valley is smoke. If we open the house, we lose the cool mass in here and pull poison down the stairwell." The monitor chirped again. 800 parts per million. Then 900. Mateo crossed to the base cabinet near the sink and opened it. Behind a false panel sat a steel wheel valve tied to an old emergency bypass duct that ran through the original crawl trench beneath the house. It was never meant to be the main system, just a fallback path if the intake tubes failed. But the brass collar around the wheel was crusted white with years of mineral scale. "I never had to use it," Mateo said quietly. He took a pipe wrench from the tool roll, locked it onto the valve stem, and pulled. Nothing. He reset his footing and pulled harder. The wrench slipped, slammed his knuckles into the cabinet frame, and drew blood. Grant took the handle next. Together they leaned on it until the tendons in Grant's neck stood out and Mateo's shoulder began to shake. The wheel did not move. The monitor chirped faster. 1,000 parts per million. Noah, half awake, sat up and rubbed at his eyes. "Why does it feel hotter?" Elena was already moving. "What freezes it?" she asked. "It's not frozen," Mateo said, breathing hard. "Scale. Corrosion. and heat-swollen threads. She looked at the stove, then at the cast-iron comal hanging over it, then back at the brass collar. Not if we make the collar move first. Mateo blinked once. Elena dropped the comal directly over the propane flame and cranked the gas. The metal heated fast, dark to gray, gray to smoking. She grabbed her welding gloves from Mateo's bench, yanked the skillet off the flame, and pressed the underside hard against the seized brass housing around the valve. The metal hissed. Grant flinched back. Elena held it there. Again and again. The room filled with the smell of hot mineral scale and old metal. Now, she said. Mateo slammed the wrench back into place. Grant took the opposite side. They pulled together. For one terrible second, nothing happened. Then a sharp metallic crack split the room. The valve wheel lurched half an inch. Mateo didn't stop. He drove the wrench again, and the valve broke free all at once, spinning open with a shriek of threads and dust. A deep rush of air came through the bypass duct, like the room had inhaled after being held under water. The propane flame snapped blue. The monitor numbers stopped climbing. Then, slowly, they began to fall. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Then Noah laughed weakly from the mattress. "Your weird cave almost suffocated us." Mateo leaned one hand on the counter, exhausted, and looked at Elena. "She fixed it." Elena pushed sweaty hair off her forehead and finally let herself smile. "Don't make me put that in writing." The second night passed with less panic. The fire line turned north. Temperatures outside stayed lethal, but the smoke thinned enough for the stars to show weakly through the vent shaft after midnight. By dawn on Saturday, wind finally eased. By mid-morning, the emergency radio traffic changed tone. Tankers in the air, road crews clearing debris, National Guard water convoys entering the county from the south. When Mateo opened the upstairs door, a wash of dirty, hot air slid over the threshold, but it no longer felt murderous. He went up first. The house above looked exhausted, but intact. Fine dust covered every surface. The main rooms smelled like sun-baked drywall and smoke. Outside, the valley had been turned a strange pale brown under the haze. Grant's house was worse. From Mateo's porch, the west face looked flayed open. The broken glass had dumped heat, dust, and smoke through the whole structure. Furniture was warped. Art on the walls had blistered. Every sleek promise of comfort inside that house had depended on systems that failed in one evening. Rescue crews reached Mesa de Oro late that afternoon. Pickup trucks from the county, utility workers, a medical unit. A local camera crew riding with them, because that's what local crews do when a disaster hits someplace scenic. The paramedic who checked Noah's pupils shook his head and said, "Another hour up there and this kid was in real trouble." A reporter with a sunburned face and a microphone asked Grant Holloway how the four of them had made it through 2 days of heat, smoke, and outage with no working air conditioning. Grant looked over at his own ruined house first. Then he looked back at Mateo's plain adobe home, at the shaded porch, at the stairwell descending into the earth. And when he spoke, There was nothing left of the man who had smiled into that excavation pit 3 years earlier. "I spent years making fun of my neighbor," Grant said. "I told people he was burying money because he didn't trust the modern world." He swallowed and looked directly at the camera. "The truth is, the modern world failed in 6 hours. His room didn't." The reporter waited. Grant pointed toward the stairs. "That place kept my son alive. It kept me alive. Everybody laughed because it looked old and thick and inconvenient, and because it didn't photograph well. But when the power died and the heat came through the walls, the only thing that mattered was whether the room still worked. His did." Later, after the trucks had gone and the valley was learning how to be loud again, Matteo and Elena sat in the cooling room eating bread, cheese, and peaches from a jar. The temperature inside had settled back to 72. The walls held steady. The floor stayed cool. Above them, the modern world was already trying to restart itself with chainsaws, generators, insurance adjusters, and promises. Elena looked around the room she had once called a chapel for soup. "You know," she said softly, "it still looks a little insane." Matteo smiled into his cup. "It looked insane before it worked." She nodded. Then she ran her hand across the clay wall, feeling the quiet weight of the earth on the other side. Above ground, comfort had been automated. Down here, survival had been engineered. And that was the kind of difference people only respected after it saved them.